We're pleased to welcome Vivian Cunningham to our lecture series tonight. Vivian grew up in Alabama, where she developed her interest in history and museum work. She recently received her bachelor's degree in fine arts from the Maine College of Art and Design and is currently working with Maine Historical Society as a collections assistant with a special focus on historic textiles and clothing. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, Vivian.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. This is, I will say, the first time that I've been speaking about this research, but I've been working with textiles almost my whole life, both for creating garments and just as someone who enjoys history, researching and just learning about where, textiles develop and how they are, important to us as humans. We wear them and we use them every day. This lecture today is focusing on the relationship between the United States North and South and how cotton impacted that. So we're going to be going over agriculture, economics, and human lives. I don't want to apologize, but this does get pretty technical as we are talking about an industry. And so I do ask if you leave questions to the end, and I will do my best to answer them. And if I don't get anything tonight, I have business cards up here, and I'd be happy to, if you can contact me, I will get back to you with the answers as I have them. So, beginning with Slater's cotton mill that was established in 1790, and the cotton gin being invented 3 years later, Southern cotton and Northern textiles developed a reciprocal relationship. They were working in tandem. The North's appetite for raw cotton spurred increased production in the growth and harvesting of cotton, just as the same as this growth and harvesting was, expanding throughout the southern United States. The North wanted more and more and was building more mills to be able to deal with this cotton boom. And thus that also increased the expansion of slavery and enslaved Africans in the United States. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, you may be familiar with him, in a speech in 1834, summarized with the quote of an unholy union between the cotton planters and fleshmongers of Louisiana and Mississippi and the cotton spinners and traffickers of New England, between the lords of the lash and the lords of the loom. They might be two different men, but they were working for the same cause. And I'm going to be talking about that a lot tonight. So, Maine has had a long history intertwined with industrial power, thanks in part to its diverse environments that made it possible for this multitude of industries to blossom, from logging to textiles to paper, each both boosting the state's economy and its population. Maine's textile industry itself can be recognized as one of the founding stones for the industrialization of textiles for the rest of the United States. And though this industry did not stay long here in the state of Maine, it is not without its lasting effects. Maine's model mill towns were used across both the country and the globe, breaking both records and boundaries. This industry, as I said, would created thousands of jobs that brought, wealth or power to some locals, and also inviting immigrants in, creating both a population boom as well as encouraging the expansions of railroads and helping and bring diverse cultures here to the state. There were also fascinating in my research cases of incidents within these mills that led to the creation of statewide laws, such as one of the most notable being when a young factory worker, a young woman, died from complications of a technically legal abortion. In 1849, the state outlawed the act as a convoluted way to try and protect these factory girls. Maine's textile industry started in the early 1820s when cotton manufacturers began expanding from Massachusetts to the Maine water systems. Almost all mills of this era relied on water power, and Maine's waters made the state a popular choice because of the prolific water that we have. Many of you may recognize the Sparhawk Mill, which was a former cotton mill here on Bridge Street. The mill that stands today is made of brick and home to several modern businesses. As the mill stands just east east of Yarmouth Second Falls. It's on the site of several previous mill buildings, the early of which that I could find dated back to about 1817. And the current mill that we recognize was built in 1855. It was replacing an earlier structure that was damaged by fire. After opening, it began operating under the name Royal River Manufacturing Company, manufacturing several different cotton products, such as yarn, cloth, and seamless grain bags. Production in this mill continued until 1951, and this is a time when there were a lot of closures across the country in cotton mills as they were moving abroad. Sparhawk was known as one of the leading industries in Yarmouth, spinning both coarse and fine yarn, and of course, as I mentioned, the seamless grain bags, which it produced about 1,000 per day at its height. And Yarmouth's Sparhawk Mill wasn't alone. In fact, Lewiston became one of Maine's first and largest cotton factories after the Bates Mill was built in the early 1850s on the Androscoggin River. This river provided the mill with almost all of its power. And it wasn't just the water power that made Lewiston such a prolific mill city, but it was also the the ease of transportation that the city had. It had connections with both the Boston and Maine Railroad as well as the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad, so that not only brought in a steady supply of labor, but also cotton. For some, it may be hard to think of or realize that there was almost no cotton grown in the United States by around 1787, the year that the federal Constitution was written. However, in 1793, a white man named Eli Whitney, you may recognize the name, revolutionized the productivity of the cotton industry when he modified existing models into a new cotton gin. If you're not familiar, the cotton gin is a machine that separates the seeds of the cotton plant, what was referred to the cotton boll, and removes them from the boll. And this is a very hard process. A cotton seed is sticky. The fibers are all clumped together. And it was why cotton wasn't really something that was very popularly grown, especially here in the United States, that didn't have a lot of technology to help it along until Eli Whitney. At this time, and really until very recently, cotton had to be handpicked from the fields. This was an arduous task because the cotton is a low-growing, rather prickly bush grown in the hot, humid southern weather. And then, as I mentioned, after it was picked, it had to be divested of its seeds, which was slow and incredibly difficult. Therefore, if you were growing cotton, you weren't growing it to make wealth. You were typically growing it and then actually spinning it on the farm that you were growing it in, and it was used for rather crude textiles. And it cannot be denied that Whitney's design was extraordinary, to the point where even after he applied to patent his machine, there were copycats being built across the states and sold. But I hesitate in this to say that Whitney invented the cotton gin, as the earliest known examples have been dated back to 5th century India, and later models have also been discovered in other cotton-growing countries, such as Egypt and China. Now, there was a type of crude cotton gin that was spread through the later Mughal Empire, and in the late 18th century, there was this type of machine being used to take the seeds from cotton, but again, it still was not an easy task, and people relied on hand and manpower to do it. The most important distinction and Whitney's real achievement in the modification of these existing models was the sorting of seeds from short staple cotton, as these other machines that I've been mentioning worked best for long staple cotton. Short and long staple cotton refers to the length of the individual cotton fibers that make up this cotton boll, and short staple was most commonly found in Georgia through Mississippi, while the longer staples were found in the upper southern states as well as Florida. They're more of a coastal variety. So here is my a little graph that kind of shows the other industries that were being grown, and that later on, short staple cotton was the one being grown most prolifically. And if you're growing this but you don't have a way to get its seeds out, it wasn't a profitable business. Nonetheless, seemingly overnight, there was a process that made this extraordinarily labor-intensive process easier. American plantation owners who had been previously making wealth by growing tobacco, rice, and sugar could now find a staple cash crop in cotton, both short and long staples. Following the War of 1812, with the increased availability of the cotton gin, there was a markedly huge increase in cotton growth, resulting in the aptly named decades-long cotton boom. And by mid-century, cotton became the cash crop of the United States. And I say a cash crop as something being grown for the farmers to sell instead of for the farmers to use themselves. And cotton was now regarded as America's most important commodity. As a commodity, cotton had the advantage against other popular cash crops, such as tobacco and rice, of being easily stored and transported with minimal risk of spoilage, and for its ability of large quantities to be packed into size-conservative bales for more efficient storage and transportation. By the 1850, of the 1.2 million enslaved individuals in the country's 15 slave states, it is estimated that 1.8 million were involved in the cotton production industry, from planting to picking. And by 1860, this labor was producing over 2 million pounds of cotton per year. American cotton actually made up 2/3 of the global supply, and it seemed like the production and increase was going to continue. For further reference, to kind of get an idea on how cotton was able to be grown so broadly across so many states, is in part thanks to a hybrid that was produced in Mississippi. It is known as Petite Gulf cotton. It's a mixture of Mexican, Georgia, and Siamese strains. Petite Gulf cotton was officially recognized in the 1820s and even patented in 1833 by a plantation owner known as Rush Nuts, who is said to have been the one to also develop the strain on his own plantation after visiting other cotton-growing regions, which included Turkey, Greece, and Egypt. This cotton strain is characterized by its disease resistance, as well as its ability to grow in varying climate and soil types. It especially dominated the Mississippi Valley region, where it was, again, originally grown, and also this considers the states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, Texas, and Missouri, but it was also pretty popular in Texas as well, but again, could be grown in other states throughout the identified South. Now, whenever a new slave state entered the Union, such as, we're all familiar with the Missouri Compromise and how we got Maine as a state, the white enslavers would send what I can really describe as armies of enslaved individuals to clear land in preparation for cotton planting. That was part of the reason that a state was being brought in. And you might not be familiar with the phrase "to be sold down the river," which was used by Harriet Beecher Stowe in her 1852 novel of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which actually is referring to this forced migration from older plantation states to new ones, as the older plantation were moving into these newer rivers, typically newer areas, typically, down referenced rivers such as the Mississippi. And these plantation owners were able to use equations that were established from other agricultural settings, such as the sugar, tobacco, rice, to predict or to estimate how much cotton they would need to plant and later be harvested based on the number of enslaved individuals that they had on their original plantation. In general, planters expected one individual to work about 10 acres of land and to pick up around 200 pounds of cotton a day. An overseer was also there to measure the individual's daily yield before it was sent off to be ginned. Now, before it actually was ginned and the seeds removed, cotton had to be dried. Cotton that was too wet would clog a machine, and cotton that was too dry was prone to breakage. And as the industry continued to advance and machines had more mechanical power to them, that sometimes led to fires, which you did not want to do because cotton is also pretty flammable. And also, if you had a whole bunch of cotton that was breaking, even though it could still be spun into pieces, spun into thread, it would have been considered a lesser quality product, and you wouldn't be able to make a lot of money off of that. A single cotton gin was capable of deseeding about 50 pounds of cotton a day, a quarter of the harvest expected of a person, and this is further compared to the 1 pound per day if it was deseeded by hand. After the seeds were removed, the cotton was produced in bales. These bales were typically weighed between 400 and 500 pounds and were wrapped in burlap cloth, such as my example here. The burlap cloth would have been a commodity from Scotland, and this is, we'll talk about it a little later, a highlight on the dependency that the South had on other nations as they were producing this product that everybody wanted. This was all that they were focusing on. So they were relying on other nations or, other parts of the United States to give them their own necessities. And then you had a bale of cotton, and it needed to be sent to the nearest port city. The cotton bale that I have here weighs about 20 pounds, and so if we add 20 more of these to the room, we would have the minimum bale weight produced throughout the South. And if anybody has been through the lovely exhibit and seen the cotton bale dolly, you can imagine 400 pounds of cotton. You can kind of see why we would need that dolly, not just for the South, but also for the mills here in the North. As the cotton industry was booming, the Mississippi River, as well as other waterways throughout the southern United States, were absolutely essential in getting cotton not just to ports, but in general from the interior states to the coast, as well as in shorter parts getting cotton just to a metropolitan railway. On a side note of transportation, I do talk a lot about steamships, as they were arguably one of the most important avenues of transportation, but railroads were also important. I found out that the United States' first long-distance rail line was launched in Maryland in 1827, helped by government funds. And by 1860, again, thanks in part to the cotton boom, and a combination of government encouragement, because they were going to be making wealth off of the cotton, as well as private businesses. There were more than 30,000 miles of rails being laid in the United States. Railroad development, however, seems to have been slower in the South, but this combined rail lines, no matter how sparse, as well as with the already well-navigated rivers, meant that very few cotton entrepreneurs had any problem getting their products from their plantations to ports or to mills throughout the Northeast or even abroad. And the increase in water travel, specifically the transporting of a large quantity of goods, was larger than it ever had been, and a desire for a quicker turnaround between trips meant that steamboats became a crucial part in this transportation revolution. And this was thanks to their combined ability of enormous freight carrying capacity, as well as being able to navigate both deep and shallow waterways. And this, again, became a driving component to the Cotton Kingdom. Steamboats also played a critical part in the visuals of class and social distinctions in the antebellum age. There were numerous kinds of steamboats, each with a different function, but the most common would have been a packet boat, which by general definition could carry human passengers as well as commercial cargo, whether that be a cash crop or even something simple like mail. And when compared to other types of craft that might have been able to carry larger amounts of cargo, these steamboats they had an additional advantage of reducing both time and expense of shipping goods with shipping both people and products. The decks would have been carrying compacted bales of cargo, as then they would have ornate rooms in the interiors for wealthy individuals. These spaces would have wealthy whites socializing in saloons. We have not a portrait, but a painting from the Mississippi River Steamboat Princess of one of the ship's many saloons. And oftentimes these individuals were attended by enslaved individuals to make sure that their experience while they're traveling was at the best that it could be. I briefly mentioned just a minute ago England. England was a very important part in this cotton boom and the cotton industry. There was a demand that already existed in England since the early 18th century. At first, cotton was being blended with linen. It was a technology that was very popular and that people already knew. So when cotton coming first from India was being introduced onto the market, they were blending it with something that they already knew. But by 1750, pure cotton cloth was being produced at increasingly rapid rates. And as cotton was being grown in the South, and more of it was, it turned out that about 75 to 80% of the cotton being produced in the U.S. was being shipped overseas. As Britain was like, oh, you have it? We can spin it. We can weave it. It's safe to say that the southern cotton that was being picked and processed by enslaved individuals was an essential part in the Industrial Revolution for both the United States and Great Britain. And this exportation of such high volumes that had really of cotton, or just a commodity in general, made the U.S. a world leader in, again, we're thinking about cotton, but the U.S. knew that they had a handle on this market, specifically the South, that it gave the Confederacy, by the time we were at the eve of the Civil War, the belief that they could bring British forces to their side of the American Civil War because of this dependency and the wealth that was here in the cotton industry. As we all know, it didn't work. Northern mills also, of course, depended on the South for cotton to be converted into textiles, but this market drastically paled in comparison to that on the Atlantic market, and the textiles being produced in northern mills were not really considered fine fabrics or what most individuals would be wearing. Of course, there are expectations to this, but in the scheme of textile weaving knowledge and the 19th century United States was very new to the game. And but this didn't stop anything. This lesser quality fabric was being used, but it was primarily being sent back to the South. It was being fashioned into cheaply made garments, often called slops, which were primarily pants, shirts, smock type, very general garments. And sometimes it was being sold directly from the bolts to primarily enslaved individuals. Grain sacks, as I mentioned, were also a very popular product that was made here in northern mills. And the sacks, of course, would have been being shipped all over the world, but it was another item that frequently made its way back to the South, being repurposed in many ways by enslaved individuals, from mattresses to other textile needs. I have a few slides here that kind of highlight again the transportation of cotton. This photo in particular, it was from the 1930s, so definitely later than our antebellum age, but it still shows how important cotton was, even though it was a smaller market. All right, so I think it is clear that the power of cotton, what power the cotton had on the world market, and how much wealth it was bringing into not just the United States, but particularly the American South. And with this came an economic dependence on other countries and also other parts of the U.S. Much of the corn and pork that was being eaten was being farmed in in the western United States. And the North itself was not only producing and supplying these lesser quality fabrics that I just talked about, but also furnishings in the home of both wealthy planters and members of the middle class. Almost any sort of item that you could think of for domestic life, from carpets, lamps, dinnerware, books, musical instruments, even some of the machinery that was being used on plantations was being produced in either the United States North or in Europe. Southern planters also borrowed money from northern banks, and in southern summers, the wealthier individuals would take advantage of these developments in transportation to travel to resorts in locations such as Saratoga, New York, Litchfield, Connecticut, Newport, Rhode Island. As we are all Mainers here, I think we're all aware of Vacation Land, as is the main nickname. And while this itself is a pretty modern term, it was still relevant in the pre-Civil War state. I have Victoria Mansion down here, which was built as a summer home for a couple who profited off of the cotton-rich South. And Maine, as well as hosting mills and, again, being a place to vacation, it was also crucial to the transportation of cotton via the ships being built along the coast, or the captains and crews that were manning them across the water, both internationally and domestically. And as the threat of the American Civil War was looming across the country, a South Carolinian politician named James Hammond was rather confident when he proclaimed that the North could never threaten the South because cotton was king. All right, so this is my favorite part of the presentation. I have one more job to talk about before we actually get to cotton being here in New England and being in a mill. And that is actually you wouldn't have gotten cotton in a mill without a cotton broker. This was a job that was as important, as I just said, to cotton growers as it was to northern mills. In both the antebellum and Reconstruction South, almost every cotton planter relied on an individual known as a factor. In this case, they would have been cotton factors, also known as cotton brokers, to sell their crops for them. As historian Clement Eastman wrote in his publication, A History of the Old South, the factor was a versatile man of business in an agrarian society who performed many different services for the planter in addition to selling his crops. He purchased or sold slaves for his clients, arranged for the hiring of slaves or the placing of planters' children in distant schools. He gave advice concerning the condition of the market or the advisability of selling or withholding the crop. He also bought for his client a large proportion of the plantation's supplies. A broker did not need to live on a plantation for this. They were usually located in an urban center of commerce, such as Charleston, Mobile, New Orleans, Savannah. Initially, they were in these harbor cities, but as railroads expanded, they were able to move inland, and again, also relying on water systems. And this was because it was more efficient to tend to business matters and be in an area that they could reach their rural clients, but also be where they could meet, I don't want to say modern society, but where the banks were. Before the American Civil War, the states of Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi were producing more than half of the world's cotton. But as states such as Arkansas, Tennessee, and Texas were increasing their own cotton productions, again, brokers were spreading out further, and there was a market for more of them. The Port of New Orleans is noted to have exported the most cotton throughout the cotton boom, being closely followed by Mobile, Alabama. And this was because of the Mississippi River, but also a couple other waterways that were easy to navigate. And once you got your cotton to the coast, to the Gulf of Mexico, you could send it just about anywhere that you wanted it to go. As I mentioned in the quote from Eastman, cotton factors were not just selling or buying cotton. They were also purchasing goods that were more easily accessible in these port cities, and then also handling the shipment of these goods to clients at their rural plantations, along with other services such as gathering news or even meeting with another client. I have a house here that is actually very similar to Victoria Mansion in terms of architecture, and it was built by a very wealthy cotton broker named Edward B. Young, and so he was working in both Alabama and Georgia for the plantation owners around there. He was buying the cotton and sending it on steamboats down the Chattahoochee River, where they would either end up in Pensacola, which was a pretty small port city considering, or he was sending them to Mobile. Like many features of the antebellum agricultural economy, the factorage system is not specifically of Southern origin. As far as I could trace it, its relative modern beginnings are in the colonial plantations of the West Indies. It's impossible for me to give a fixed date on the emergence of this factorage or broker system. But the United States itself, it's easy to identify as this system's emergence with the fall of, British rule after the American Revolution. Again, cotton was not something that was grown really before the emergence of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. But there were other cash crops and commodities that were being grown, such as indigo, which I haven't talked about. It didn't really rely on a broker system, but instead of what is called an English bounty system, which pretty much completely disappeared by the end of the American Revolution. And the bounty system is defined as a sum that was being paid typically by a government that was paid to encourage trade. And it was very popular in England and France. But with the bounty system coming out, it left individuals to create what, if they themselves, if a government wasn't supplying the money, someone else was like, I could provide that money, or better yet, I could buy directly from you and turn around and sell it. After the fall of really indigo planting comes tobacco, and the tobacco culture was a little more restricted, and it didn't really offer a widespread capitalistic way of thinking, but it did kind of set the stage for our next commodity, which is rice and sugar, which were kind of being grown at the same time, and together they developed a factorage system, this broker system, that was best translated into the cotton factor. The cotton factor, just like his colonial ancestor, was the home agent. In the beginning, he was the merchant and the banker, and they later kind of split off into two separate, job descriptions. But he was arguably the most important link in this cotton industry chain. He was there to make sure that the products were being grown and figuring out where they were being exported to. And this brought Europe, Africa, and America in the linked commercial association. The importance of this Southern factorage system developed with, again, the growth of not just the cotton plant, but the cotton industry from plant to mill. And it was, I think I said this before, one of the reasons that cotton was so prolific was because of its non-perishable nature, which other commodities, no matter if you were the one buying it outright or if you were facilitating the sale for somebody else, if that product is ruined, whether it's in your hands or, in basically any time, by the time it got to a mill or somebody else, you were losing money. Cotton, that risk was a lot lower. And sorry for that tangent, but the cotton broker and the plantation owner had ties that were frequently lifelong, and how far this personal association affected plantation policy, I really can't say, but I am pretty confident when I say that the counsel and advice of a cotton broker was frequently reflected in the planter's affairs and actions across the plantation, and they also affected not just businesses, but also political, social, and economic decisions. I think it is very important to note, as I wrap up talking about cotton brokers, that this was not just Southern men buying and selling for Southern men, and while there was plenty of that, this was also a large quantity of Northern businessmen, Northern cotton brokers that were buying and selling for Northern factories, Northern banks, or just for themselves, in the example of Mr. Edward B. Young. And as I outlined this undeniable closeness of the cotton broker with the planter, I think this helps highlights another level of complicity that the United States North held with slave labor. If it's any easier, I know I just threw a lot of information out there. You can think of the cotton broker as today's stockbroker. Everybody wanted cotton. Now, you may have noticed I have been focusing a lot on the cotton industry in the South, and I've only briefly mentioned aspects of what was happening here in the North. And that's because I think that I really needed to define the industry as a whole, and I couldn't just do that in one part of the United States. And the cotton industry was not just a massive player in the development of the transportation industry, in agriculture, in commerce, but it also, of course, was a major player in factories, in the development of factory systems, both locally and abroad. Textile mills, as we generally recognize them today, have been around since the mid-16th century as textile production moved away from being seen as household work to essentially an operation for pure profit, again with England domineering this trade. Originally, these textiles were wool and linen, but as cotton, coming from India and Egypt before it was coming from the US. As it began entering the market, it was remarkably easier for these existing mills to make a switch to these other types of fibers. And as textile mills began popping up in the later United States, interested American parties, American businessmen were typically going abroad to English mills to learn about these secrets of success and just how they were able to make such great fabrics and how to make money. So I have a rather terrifying, but I love graph that highlights essentially what it takes to get cotton from bale to bolt of cloth, bundle of yarn, or cone of thread. It's pretty intimidating when you have it labeled out into individual components. And as I'm sure you might be thinking now, or realizing now, that the conception of the cotton industry, as well as really any industry, is incredibly labor intensive. But in general, this process here can be condensed and explained in 6 steps, of which I've already gone over 2. I won't be going into every detail that I have on the screen, but I will try my best to keep it comprehensive. And I need a water break. So I've already gone over cultivating and harvesting, which is defined by anything that was being done in the location that the product was, the product's origin. And this includes getting the plants, ginning, and baling. After that, it is loaded onto a boat or train and sent to any mill that the cotton broker wished it to go. After that, we had some preparatory processes that needed to happen, and this would have happened to everything, no matter if it was being turned into cloth yarn or thread. First thing is these compact bales needed to be broken up, and even though they already had their seeds removed from them, they still had vegetable matter. Sometimes they still had seeds. As I mentioned, they were very sticky, so even if it wasn't entangled in the bundle, it could still be attached to some loose fibers. And so there was this machine called the opener that was in charge of opening these bundles and fluffing it up and trying to get as much vegetable matter as possible. Sometimes fans were involved in aiding this process, but in general they were trying to create a big sheet known as lap, which was then sent through another machine that was carding, which was just to get the threads or the fibers going in a single direction so that you could easily spin a strong thread. After it was carded, it was typically, but not always, combed. And this was a process that was removing the shortest of the fibers away and only leaving the longest, as that would again create a stronger product. But again, if you were not trying to create a super fine fabric, you didn't really need to do this. If you were just trying to make a textile, then you could skip this product and still be able to make a decent textile product. Next, we move on to spinning. Spinning machines would take roving, which was created from the carding and possibly if you went through the combing process, but you didn't have to, again. But spinning really is just thinning out this roving and twisting it. That was creating a yarn and being wound onto a bobbin. Today, there's a process called open-end spinning that was developed in the 1960s, so it's very modern. And so for the 19th century, there were 2 methods of spinning. We have mule spinning, which gets its name from the original machines that required the mule, the animal, to operate, or ring spinning. Mule spinning was desired if you wanted to make a thin, fine thread It was ring spinning. It could make a decent thread, but not something that you're making a fine fabric out of. Mule spinning was used in both the U.S. and England. Ring spinning was pretty much just the U.S. And it was identified as something that could, do I have it quoted? You didn't need as fine a worker for it. You didn't need someone who could be a pretty run-of-the-mill person, essentially, to operate a ring spinning machine. Now, we get to weaving. They're really, after you get your yarn created, it either through the spinning process could be further refined into a sewing thread. It could be left as a yarn, but nonetheless, it had two options after this. It was woven or it was knit. Let's see. There are many different types of looms, and they're all dependent on the type of fabric that is desired, but there's really three main functions that every loom has, which is shedding, which is where you see the little bars that are going up and down. Those are the sheds. Those are creating the weaving pattern. You have picking, which is essentially where the shuttle is being thrown across the fabric to create the textile, and then you have the beating, which there's that hammer bar there, and that's beating the fibers or the threads into a compact textile. The other option that your thread could go through was to be knit. There were pretty much two methods in which things could be knit through a mill, and that was it could be knit as a rectangle or it could be knit as a circle. You can only weave in a rectangle. So knitting was pretty cool because you can make socks or hosiery. And there are two typical knit patterns. You have, sorry, getting a little mixed up. You have weft knitting, which is similar to hand knitting, and then you have warp knit, which is the zigzag pattern. Warp knits don't have as much stretch to them, but they are identified as run resistance, which means that you could break a thread and all of them won't unravel. But weft knit is more stretchy. And so, like a T-shirt or a typical sock is made of a weft knit. And then after your product was either knit into a textile or after it was woven into a textile, there is a broad range of treatments that could happen to finish it. And these all depended on what you were doing with the textile after, what value you wanted to add, what function the textile was destined to have. So I definitely won't be going into any of those, but it did, require a general cleaning process to just get rid of the grime of a mill. And then after that, were you bleaching it just to be pure white? Did it need to be dyed? Was it just going to be something pretty utilitarian that you were going to put a stamp on as a manufacturing stamp? And that was, again, all dependent on the mill and the ultimate destination of this textile. And I apologize for going pretty long, but this brings us to the end of my lecture and my research. I'd love to go on because we could continue talking about the diseases amongst mills and just the general populations that were working in them. But I'll leave it here and open the floor to questions if you have them. And again, if I can't answer it right now, I have some business cards and would be happy to answer them at another point. And thank you for sitting here and listening to this lecture. So, thank you.
So, I think I have it right. So the woolen mills were in Maine and New England or the North already, and then they switched over to cotton.
There was not wool. Wool was England.
Okay.
Yeah, so the mills that were being the textile mills that were being erected here in the United States were from the get-go cotton, but they were only after cotton was being grown and commercially sent out across the U.S. 18th century or pre-19th century, any cotton that was being grown in the United States was being essentially milled into a textile in the location that it was grown. It wasn't being sent out to a different sort of mill. It wasn't until the cotton industry. Again, it's hard that you can't separate cotton being grown and shipped out without also, the mills. They were kind of functioning at the same time. Because if you're popping up a mill, I need to plant more. Oh, I'm planting this much more. You should put up another mill.
And were there also mills in the South?
Not really, because they were focusing on exclusively growing. It wasn't until after the Civil War that the South started also milling their own. But again, by the 1950s, mills were moving abroad all across the board. Not to poke fun at Seth, but now I know what a class feels like when nobody asks a question.
How about, did you find anything about blue jean production in your research?
I did, and that could be a whole lecture in and of itself. I did not find a lot of evidence of what we denim production here in the U.S. itself. But a material being made into pants is kind of the lesser quality fabrics that were slops. But blue jean fabric is denim, which is a specific type of weave, which you need a specific loom for. And those were not in the U.S. Yeah.
So you mentioned the finer threads, and for fine, what would they go into? What sort of end product would come from those finer threads?
So
if it wasn't garments.
Yeah, so the finer threads could have been something that was physically a fine, thin material that was a sewing thread. But also considering that they were being made into textiles, and these finer threads were being made into the poplins, the cotton gauzes, the nicer bed linens, not your, you have like a schlub yarn, which has thin and thick areas of it, and that's like what the grain bags are made of. So a finer fabric kind of refers to the quality of it and also the width of the material it's being made of.
So it sounds like here mostly we got, not the dregs exactly, but not the finest materials here. So the things that were made in Maine tended to be the more crude things like grain bags.
Yes. And that is really because we had the technology at our fingertips. We did not have the technical knowledge within the workers to do it. Because even if you have the machinery, you still need to have someone who knows how to work that machinery. And again, in the instance of ring spinning, it is said that you could have someone operating a ring spinner that really didn't need to know about the machine. If they knew how to go to point A to point B, they could run the machine. But if you have someone who knows the machine and knows the more of the process, you would get a better quality product out of it. Yes?
You obviously know a lot about the cotton industry, and I'm curious as to what drew you to that. I mean, why did you get interested in the cotton industry?
I'm from Alabama. I am from the South, and I grew up on a farm that was actually just right down the road from someone who still grows cotton. So I was physically surrounded by the plant, and also my mom is a historian, and I kind of couldn't escape it. And so just by being in that environment, it just led to this. Yeah.
Have you had the chance to be in a weaving mill?
Not one that's operating. I have been to one up here in the north. I've also been to a sock knitting factory in Alabama, which again, had the knitting machines and was making hosiery, and they were making cotton socks and stuff. So, yes.
I ask because I think a lot of us may have known folks or in our family who've worked in some or many of these mills around here.
Mm-hmm.
And the stories of, is the water up, number one? Is the water flowing so that everything can run? This is particularly on the Androscoggin. And then if it is running, that whole place is just shaking. It's like, it'd be so scary, I would think like these floors are gonna fall through. But it was just loud and moving.
And heavy.
And heavy, yeah.
Yeah.
So.
I'll put in a quick plug for our exhibit. If you are interested in seeing the texture of one of these Royal River seamless braided bags, we have one on display in the museum. The bale dolly that was mentioned too was in the museum, as well as some photos of the cotton mill.
Yeah.
And the mill workers here in town.
And again, if anybody would like to pick the bale up, it's about 20 pounds, and so just add 20 more of these for a 400 pound bale of cotton that you would need the dolly just to be able to move. Mm-hmm. All right. Again, thank you guys for having me here. Thank you, Yarmouth, and thank you everybody in attendance as well for listening in. Thank you.